Now, one of the foundation principles of New African culture is spirit. And when we form a New African culture, it's spirit-based. Ethiopianism is an expression of the spirit orientation of African people. We hardly do anything unless spirit's in it. You call it religion, but these Africans were not into religion on the continent. And generally the Africans throughout enslavement weren't either. They weren't Christians. They weren't into a Bible. They weren't into a prophet. They were into the spirit of God that dwelled within them. And so spirit is like the sine qua non of all African cultures. Again, most African American historians, not all, but too many, want to dismiss spirit as an important factor when we're examining the formation of African American culture, because spirit practices are found in almost all cultures. But that's a mistake, because not all cultures define their central motive for being around spirit. Kemet was basically a spirit-based civilization, and a lot of our scholars miss it because they've intellectualized it so much. Every aspect of Kemetic civilization was inspired by spirit. Their art, what was it? It was the art generally put in the tombs, for the afterlife, to lead people to the afterlife. If you look at Ma'at, what is that? That's energy. That's a spirit that pervades heaven, the cosmos, and Mother Earth. Every aspect of African culture is spirit-based. The Greeks weren't like that. Theirs was more a material culture. Understand? The Chinese, in their first two dynasties, were very spirit-based. Those were Black dynasties. But by the third dynasty, Confucius, when he's formulating Confucianism, says this about the spirits: respect the spirits, but keep your distance. So there's deep down in Chinese culture a spirit foundation, but it is not central to the drive of Chinese culture. Lao Tzu, we have a brother who's very dedicated on this show called Lao Tzu, but Lao Tzu, the great philosopher, his philosophy was spirit-based, but it is not the philosophy that became the popular philosophy of most of the people of China. So it's a mistake to downplay the role of spirit when it comes to the creation of African American culture, New African culture. And of course, you wouldn't dismiss it in the Caribbean. You wouldn't dismiss it in South America. No Haitian revolution without voodoo. The spirit of the ancestors of Africa, Dahomean, Yoruba, Asante, along with Petro or Indian rites mixed, that fuels that revolution. The only one to overthrow slavery in the history of the world. So it is a mistake to downplay the role of spirit in African American culture, in its formation, and in its persistence. So W.B. Du Bois was insightful on this because he was one of the first scholars to recognize the role of what he called the Obeah man or woman, the diviner. And it was Du Bois who said, and these were the leaders on the plantation, they were not preachers, very few of them. And Nat Turner himself was a transition between the African spirit practices and what you call Christianity, just as Sundiata was in the rebellion that he led in Mali against Samungura. He's basically leading a spirit rebellion, magic forces against magic forces, leading armies in the name of Islam. But most Malian historians will tell you, no, he wasn't really Muslim, meaning he was largely spirit-based and didn't believe he could win until his spirit could outmatch the spirit of Samangura, his enemy. And of course, his armies beat him. Because those of you who are putting everything on the Lord, you better praise the Lord. You heard me before, pass something, pass some ammunition, you better be some power in it, because the Lord's going to help you if you help yourself. So Du Bois observed of these Africans who were the natural leaders on the plantation. He said of them, and I quote, "They were the interpreters of the supernatural, the comforters of the sorrowing, and the ones who rudely and picturesquely expressed the longing, disappointment, and resentment of a stolen and oppressed people." He's describing a leadership that was both spiritual and political. And you couldn't have a revolt unless these two were together. So if you're going to understand Ethiopianism, you got to understand its grounding and the orientation of the African who picked this up, whether it's in the US, the Caribbean, or in Africa, because this African, wherever he is in the world, God's in almost everything. You hear me? We see God where God isn't even involved. If there's a real bad earthquake, we're reading it as, oh, someone did wrong, you know, except when it hits Black people, then you got to start to ask, what happened here? You know what I mean? So the thing is, when we're talking about Ethiopianism, understand its roots in the spirit base. And the spirit base also serves as the womb out of which Pan-Africanism comes. So old Nat Turner, when he leads his rebellion, it comes from dreams. Again, spirit. And that's what inspires him, you know, along with it's the oppression that we face that is the cause, but the force that enables him to stand up against a system that's very, very difficult to defeat, put his life on the line, was again, spirit. This little light of mine. So Ethiopianism had both a political and spiritual lineage. So race consciousness becomes a new expression of the pride of our people, expressed in identifying with the Black race worldwide. And it's a part of, and we'll see Ethiopianism itself plays a big role in our identifying ourselves as African, first because first couple of generations came from Africa, but they did not see themselves as African. They saw themselves as Yoruba, Asante, Igbo, Bambara, whatever their ethnic group. It's only over time that race consciousness and then Ethiopianism contributes to the development of this idea of us being African. And so we see the Africans in enslavement and free men and women of color calling their organizations free African societies. This was the foundation on which the Black church was launched among Africans who were so-called free, which they weren't. They just, you know, were not enslaved on plantations. They had the right to vote or almost anything. So you had groups like the African Lodge, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the Free African Society of Philadelphia, the African Free Schools, the African Female Band Benevolent Society, the African Friendly Society of St. Thomas. And this was a society here in the US, probably some of those had been from St. Thomas. The African Theater of New York, the African Grove, which was a place also where theater productions were performed. And for the purpose of this discussion, most importantly, the Daughters of Ethiopia. Ethiopianism plays a big part in this whole idea of African identity. And what becomes Pan-Africanism. So what's most important about all the names of these and other associations is that they demonstrated that the African Americans' racial consciousness led them to see themselves as Africans under the banner of Ethiopianism. And it inspired Africans in the US, it inspired Africans in the Caribbean, and it inspired Africans on the African continent to begin to see themselves not just as ethnic people, and there's nothing wrong with that. The Bambara, a nation or an ethnic group, great culture. Igbo, Yoruba, all of these make up the cultures of Africa. But they began to see themselves in the broader sense as having a commonality, as being Africans. This is a shift of consciousness from the saltwater Africans to those who begin to evolve this new African culture in the US and this Caribbean, African Caribbean culture in the Caribbean, or for those who are in South America and Suriname, places like that.